Look, YouTube, welcome back to a new video with Rams fan YT. Today I'm going to be I did this last season, if you remember, but this season's managers who deserve to be sacked. So that's past tense and managers who have been sacked, who maybe should or shouldn't, in my opinion, whether they should or shouldn't have been sacked, and also any current managers, which I believe are quite lucky to still be in a job, let's say. Let me know if you agree with my decisions down in the comment section below. Would you have sacked your club's manager when they did, or if they haven't, would you sack your manager? Please let me know all of them things down below. We'll start with the Premier League with Dean Smith. I think he should have been sacked. On top of 5 defeats, Villa's performances were quite concerning. In those 450 minutes they played, well, for about an hour of all his games. But 40 points gained from their last 36 games is the real reason why I'm for Smith's sacking. I mean, it's quite poor record when you think about it. I am, of course, referring to when he was at Villa, not the Norwich one. He also spent much money, which was raised by Grealish's sale, buying in Ings and Buendia, and they were his decision and they didn't work. He also dropped England international club captain Tyrone Mings, which I don't think was a good idea. Thomas Frank, I believe, should be relegated. Should have been sacked. Maybe not now, but certainly when they had a chance, they maybe should have. They were almost in a relegation battle at one point. Actually, almost relegated, I think. And if you look at Villa or Newcastle, they changed their manager before they dropped that low, and now have been mid-table since then. I would say he was lucky that his bad form coincided with a January transfer window, as he could bring in players that would improve the squad. For example, Christian Eriksen, and maybe it's for players which are helping save Frank over any actual ability on his behalf. Graham Potter, I would have also sacked. It's easy to forget, looking at Brighton's current form, about where they actually were. Potter was under severe pressure at the turn of the year, and Brighton were perilously close to a drop. And many fans were actually asking if Potter was the right man to take the team forward. He has also had too many draws this season, in my opinion, as well as 6 defeats in a row in the February-March time. And 4 of those games were achievable to get something out of, really. They lost to Villa, Newcastle, Burnley, and the Manchester United of this year. So they really shouldn't have been on that run. And maybe they could have, even if it wasn't for that run, maybe they've even been pushing for Europa League or something like that. Sean Dyche, I would have kept in the job. I know it seems a bit odd after the last 3 I just rattled off who should have been sacked. But if you'd given him a decent budget, you would have never had to worry about being relegated in the first place. I think he has been one of the best Premier League managers of all time. There's 10 years with a club that has a very small budget, one of the smallest, and I think actually the smallest in the Premier League for most of them years. And a 7th place finish they had under him during that time. And 2 promotions from the Championship. Just shows that he's a very good manager. He would have been able to get them out of the Championship, not a doubt I have that. And there wasn't even any issues in changing rooms. The changing rooms wanted him to stay. So I don't really know why they dismissed him. He wasn't that bad of a form, I don't think, when they dismissed him. And although they've had a brief bounce back, I don't think really Michael Jackson's the long core answer to the problems there. I think you shouldn't have brought a club with debt from a club like Manchester United have been brought. That's just my opinion. The owners shouldn't have done that. Rafa Benitez, I wouldn't have appointed in the first place, and for that reason, I probably wouldn't have sacked him either. Not really sticking by your guns there. They have been unlucky with injuries this season, with both Townsend and Davis being injured during his time, 2 instrumental players, arguably. If he had got given a decent budget as well to bring in his own players, which they did with Lampard. Lampard brought in Dele Alli and Van der Beek, both Lampard's signings. Rafa Benitez got none of that. I don't know if I wanted a transfer embargo or not, but there was very heavy threatened point deduction, I know that. They were also only 6 points from safety in, 6 points from the relegation zone, rather. So 6 points clear. In 15th when they left, whereas now I think they're 16th on the table, and may have got more than 2 points from safety now, like 2 points gap. They may have changed that from last night to confirm safety just, but it's regression. I mean, I know Everton fans don't like Rafa Benitez. He's a Liverpool legend, and I understand that. And that's why I wouldn't have appointed him. But I also don't see why they sacked him when they did. Marcelo Bielsa, I would have sacked. Leeds took only 1 point from his last 6 games to leave them outside of the relegation zone by only 2 points. And therefore, he maybe should have had his legacy as getting them relegated, as this is what is going to happen. I mean, I know there's one game left where theoretically they could get out of it if Burnley lose their game and they pick up a point in or more and the other one. I just don't see them doing it. I think they're going to be relegated, and it's entirely Bielsa's fault. Leeds at the time conceded 21 goals in 6 games. I think that tells you all you need to know. That's more than 3 goals a game. They lost 4-0 at home to Tottenham and were thrashed 6-0 away at Liverpool, leaving them with a goal difference of -30 and the leakiest defence in the Premier League. They shipped 60 goals in 26 games under him. That was 5 more than the bottom side, Norwich. The style of play also needed to change. They were too attacking. They were just trying to outscore the opposition, and because of the crisis of injuries in the strikers department, they couldn't obviously enforce that position of just attacking. So instead, they just ended up conceding loads of goals without scoring in the event. They needed to focus on defence, really, and Bielsa wouldn't have done that. That's not in his remit, really. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, controversially, I would have kept. There was clearly no long-term replacement at the time to put him in. That's why they brought Rangnick in. And can you actually tell me that Rangnick has done a better job? I don't think he has. In fact, they've probably regressed under him slightly. There's also clearly a toxic dressing room at the club. That hasn't changed when he was sacked, so it must have been something which was done beforehand. Maybe that it was being undermined by Ed Woodward at the club in the transfer department. We got the likes of Lingard, Maguire, Pogba, and Ronaldo. They're just not working together, are they? And Lingard, I think, has come on record of being very disgusted about being almost held ransom at Manchester United, and they didn't really get on board with either Ollie's idea or the ideas of Rangnick. I don't know about the Ten Hag situation of him coming in. Maybe he can improve them, but Solskjaer could have been at least given the end of the season if that's what they were going to go down all the time. The Glazers are also at fault. They appointed him in the long term. I wouldn't have actually extended it beyond his interim period. And they always made these recruitment mistakes. It's just simple. Steve Bruce should have been left in the job at Newcastle. I wouldn't have put him at West Brom personally. I wouldn't sack him either. But I wouldn't have sacked him at Newcastle. Just because the thing is, the Geordies wanted Benitez, and anyone who stepped into Benitez was going to have a rough end of the stick, and especially seeming Bruce's style of play is a bit boring, but that boring style of play was actually effective. He was doing okay results-wise as well, with plenty of draws, and just really needed a win. But, could have changed them around, especially seeing how much backing Eddie Howe has had in the transfer market. He shouldn't have been appointed in the first place, if we're really honest. But I don't think Eddie Howe has done that much better job of Steve Bruce. Obviously, the table would say otherwise. But I reckon if Steve Bruce had the same amount backing, then who would have known if anything would have changed? I reckon it would be very similar results-wise. Nuno Espirito Santo, I would have kept him a job. Why was he appointed in the first place if you weren't going to give him time? He only had 17 games in charge at Tottenham. And I don't think he deserves to lose his job because he came in such difficult circumstances. He had the whole Harry Kane fiasco at the start of the season. So did he bring in a new striker to replace him? But he wasn't going to leave, and you'd obviously don't want to usurp him and force him out the door. And the age of the squad as well is quite old now. And you have to try and rebuild that squad with a very condensed transfer window and pre-season. Didn't really get a chance to settle in. And also only 4 points off the Champions League when he was dismissed. And it was still very early in the season. Could have very well got them into the Champions League as well. Just needed a bit of time. Xisco, I would have kept. He picked up 7 points from their first 7 matches. A respectable tally, really, for a newly promoted side, and one which was obviously going to be challenging for relegation zone if you look at the squad. They are a yo-yo club, and he did his job getting them promoted. And it was unlikely to get a really good run of form. They've always have quite bad runs of form after him. They did as well, and I think he did quite well. He was picking up a point per game, so I think this season, if you get picked up a point per game, you would actually be safe, I think. Or not, maybe challenging in relegation zone, but not as badly as Watford are doing now. Claudio Ranieri I would have sacked, though. I am going with the Watford owners at this point. The ex-Foxes boss only managed to get 2 wins in 14 games at Watford. One was against Everton at Goodison Park, so that does go for him, and one was at home to Manchester United, but that was a terrible display by the Red Devils, and that got Ole Gunnar Solskjaer sacked. So you could argue that Ranieri shouldn't have been appointed in the first place. He was relegated with Fulham as his last job. It just was a bit of a bizarre appointment. Everyone didn't think it at the time. They also lost 3-0 to Norwich, which is absolutely criminal. You can't lose 3-0 to a relegation contender. And the dressing room was toxic under him. He had no control over the dressing room, according to reports, obviously. Roy Hodgson, I wouldn't have him as manager. I would have sacked him. I don't know why they were waiting till the end of the season, really. Hodgson has offended the Watford fans already by celebrating with Palace fans. I know they don't want to extend his deal, but after losing the game, celebrating with the Palace fans just rubs salt into the wounds, doesn't it? He also lost the last 6 games with Burnley, Leeds, and Brentford, all teams he could have realistically got a result on. And maybe not necessarily wins, but at least draws against some of them. I just feel like he's a bit outdated now, Roy, and he's just not quite as good as he was back in the day, let's just say. Marcus Schopp into the Championship, obviously, should have been sacked. He wasn't known beforehand, and he had a really poor start with Barnsley. Barnsley sacked Daniel Stendel with 6 points from 11 games, but Schopp had only had 8 points from 12 games. That's not a better record. That's really not that different. So, not really lots different. They were in the relegation zone as well when he got dismissed. They also only won 1 game in 15 matches. That only had 4 draws in it as well, and including a run of 7 straight defeats. They've got a lot of quality players in that squad, given they finished last season in 5th. I think that's fairly obvious. So something must have gone downhill, and I would say it's because Ismail left and Shopper's just not done a good enough job to replace him. Puya Asbaghi also would have sacked. He started off his sort of managerial tenure with only 4 points from safety, and he ended with Barnsley getting relegated and finishing behind Derby, despite being 14 points ahead when he came in. I mean, how do you end up doing that bad? He lost 17 out of 28 games in charge, leaving Barnsley at the foot of the table. He only picked up 5 points away from home during a spell at Barnsley. Mick McCarthy I would have sacked. The Bluebirds picked up only 11 points from his 14 championship games in charge during this season. They lost 8 games in a row. 8 games in a row. Imagine living at 8 games until sacking your manager. And all of them being losses. And they also didn't score for 5 games in a row. I mean, I know I backed McCarthy at the beginning of the season, but I think he's past it as well. I think he belongs in the generation of ex-good managers, probably not to be recruited again. Grant McCann should have been sacked from Hull. Although when he was sacked, it was after 2 wins on the bounce, including one against Bournemouth. His form at his time at Hull had been patchy. He had a run of 5 defeats in October, and he also didn't really get along with the new owners. So it was always kind of inevitable that he was going to get the chop at some point, and I think probably the wrong time, but he should have been dismissed either way. Neil Warnock should have stayed in the job for me. He was only allowed 17 months, and I know that's quite a long time now, but to build a squad, there was room for improvement was seen in several of his performances, but it could be seen for improvement. He also won about a third of his games in charge. I mean, that's not bad. He had 6 wins in 17 games, and they weren't really threatened from relegation. I know that's not where Middlesbrough want to be. They don't want to be anywhere near relegation zone. But I do think Warnock would have turned it around if he was given a chance. He does have that as a track record. He's obviously one of their managers which has been known for getting teams out of the Championship. But of course, he's now retired, a figure of history, we can maybe say. Chris Hughton, I would have kept. I mean, just to annoy the Forest fans, but I would have kept him. They lost if they did lose the East Midlands derby, then yeah, he should have been sacked. But he was a good servant to the club, and it's obvious that he had the squad to do good things. And who's to say that he wouldn't have turned it around instead of the current manager? The games he managed, they were still in most of the games. They only lost by very fine margins, most of them only by a goal, and that could very easily turn around. Darren Ferguson should have been kept in the job as well. I know he resigned. So maybe he shouldn't be included in this video, but because he did resign. But it seems like he was almost forced out. They were still 5 points from safety though at the time. And when he left, the Posh were expected to be relegated. Well, Ferguson knows how to get a team promoted. We've seen that with him doing it at the Posh before. They could have even stayed up with him in charge, but, it wasn't to be. Frankie McAvoy, I would have kept. He managed to get them to 18th until he was sacked with 8 losses in 21 games. So that's not too bad of a record. He had 6 wins and so many draws. But considering Preston were almost relegated last season, if it wasn't for McAvoy coming in, where he won 5 games in 8 matches last season, I would have just given him a bit more time to sort of shape his squad. He wasn't given that long. Mark Warburton, I would have sacked. Towards the end of the season, when they could have been plussing for the playoffs, they only won 1 game in 9. And that included a run of 5 defeats, including against relegation battlers Peterborough. He's also come out criticising referees instead of taking responsibility for himself. So he's almost sort of deflecting it. Everyone else apart from me, problem. But we know that QPR is the squad to be in the playoffs because they were for most of the season. So they really should have done better, and they should have dismissed him earlier. Maybe they would have been in the playoffs if they did. Veljko Paunovic, obviously, sacked. Not a question. The Royals lost 8 successive games under him, including a game against Kidderminster Harriers, for goodness sake, a non-league team in Tier 6. And they were only 2 points above the Championship relegation places. I mean, Reading realistically should have been nowhere near relegation zone. Zhao and Swift, they shouldn't be battling with a relegation zone. They could have been at least lower mid-table and around about 18th, I reckon. Slavisa Jokanovic, I would have kept actually at Sheffield United. He only had 22 games at the wheel, and he won 8, drew 6, and lost 8. It's an all right record, around about 50%, 50-50 from wins to losses, isn't it? His final match in charge was actually a win at Reading, 1-0 win, albeit, but it's still a victory. In fact, they didn't even lose the game before that either. They drew 0-0 with the team in 5th place of Coventry. So things looked positive in him, and probably was a wrong time to dismiss him. He could have very easily got them into the playoffs, as which they were now. And he's a playoff specialist, so they wouldn't have maybe lost against Nottingham Forest if he was still in charge. Valérien Ismaël, I would have kept in charge. He won 12 of his 31 matches in charge, and the Baggies were 5th when he was dismissed, being only 8 points adrift of the automatic places. Maybe that wasn't good enough for them. But they brought in Steve Bruce, and he wasn't the manager needed, was he? The players were clearly the issue thereafter, being a bright pain for him. Don't know if they were performing necessarily for Ismaël as well, maybe colluding to get him out of the club. But they're now finished the season in 10th, and they only, under Ismaël, lost 2 games on the bounce at any given time. Really baffling. I know his style of play didn't suit with the Baggies, but neither does Bruce. So what have you gained from sacking him? Mark Robinson, I would have sacked. They had 21 games straight without a victory. They were 21st in the table and 1 point away from safety. He has a win percentage of only 25%, and that gets you relegated. Wimbledon, chop him. I know he's been loyal to you for quite a while now, maybe 2018-19 season, I think he came in, and he has kept you from safety before, but I would have definitely sacked him. Actually, they maybe have sacked him. Nigel Adkins, I would have kept. He only had 7 months in charge, hardly long enough to build a squad in his image, really. They started the season well, and glimpses were seen under him. And he didn't get really the backing of the board, did he, in the summer transfer window? Couldn't have a settled side due to the injuries. I remember there were so many injuries with Charlton at the beginning of the season, so they were languishing because of that. 16 players also had to leave in the summer. He did bring in 15, but you need time for that to gel and your squad to work. And I think Nigel Adkins is a better manager than his replacement. Johnny Jackson, I would have sacked. He had a woeful run in February, losing 5 games on the bounce and 6 losses in 7 games, which meant really the playoffs were beyond them if they were ever aiming for the playoffs. I would have imagined that would have been a remit at the beginning of the season, but probably not the time that he came in. I wouldn't have appointed him permanently in the first place, despite a good vein of form when he was interim. But if you're giving him after a short sample size, you need to look at a whole sort of about half a season at least before you appoint an interim a full-time manager, in my opinion. David Artell, I would have sacked. His last game was the 8th defeat on the bounce, and he lost 15 of his last 16 games, which really tells you everything. He should have been sacked much earlier, and that might have been prevented might have prevented Crewe from being relegated, really. Richie Wellens would have kept at the club. He wasn't financially backed at the club, and they were restricted by several injuries during his time. His remit, apparently at the start of the season, was actually just to keep the club up. So maybe he didn't feel under that much pressure, which is probably why he was sacked, because he didn't have anything to aim towards. Before he went in, they had only won 3 games in 24. Well, when he came in, they won 6 in 26. So it is improvement, I would say. At the start of the season, he didn't even have a fit centre forward or winger. So how was he meant to score any goals to win games in the first place? Doncaster Rovers, your club is run absolutely horrendously, I have to say. I would have sacked Gary McSheffrey, though. The dressing room had no respect for the club or the manager. So why is he still here? Wasn't it something that the players were celebrating Doncaster getting relegated? I think I read somewhere. And when he came in December, they lost 5 games on the bounce. So why they made him a permanent manager, I do not know. And he is more to blame really for relegation than Richie Wellens is, but as the owners are as well, and the players. But the book ends up with a manager most times. Simon Grayson, I would have kept in the job. It was always going to be a relegation scrap, and he was only one win from getting out of relegation zone, and it was only November at the time, mind you. He could have beaten Wimbledon easily, but instead they sacked him and they could only draw instead. It's a difficult one to call, as it was very early in the season, so no trends could really be gathered about whether he deserved to be sacked or not. Stephen Craney, I would have sacked. Fleetwood only survived on goal difference in the end, and it could have been much easier if they sacked Craney earlier. He lost 5 games in March and the bounce, and between January and April, they didn't win a single game. They only picked up 6 points out of a potential 39 up for offer. Steve Evans, I would have sacked. His ideas are outdated, which is why Gillingham were relegated, especially due to that spell in November-December time. They were 22nd when he was sacked, and he lost 6 of his last 7 games in charge, and hadn't actually won a game in 13 games. In his last game in charge, he actually conceded 4 goals against Ipswich. And he hasn't had much of an impact on any of the last 2 clubs before he joined Gillingham. So you've got to question the appointment of him in the first place. I doubt people have much love towards him anymore. He used to be a good manager, but not anymore. Maybe football is better without him. Although I think he moved to Stevenage now, hasn't he? Well, Stevenage has survived this season, so must be doing something right. Paul Cook, I would have kept. Right, listen here, Ipswich. He should have been given much longer. He had a large turnover in the summer, 27 to 30 players. I can't remember the exact amount were leaving, and only 19 came in. That's not really replacing, is it? That's restricting the squad quite a bit. That's a completely different team as well. I mean, how would you expect them to gel in so short of a time? I don't know. Only 20 games he had in charge. And in his last 14 games, he had 7 wins, 3 draws, and 4 defeats. That's an all right run of form. He also didn't really have a pre-season with his new players, so should have been given much more time. And you never know, it could have actually been playoff contenders if they didn't sack him. Michael Appleton, I would have kept at the club. Although, does it really count? He left after his own accord. He didn't get sacked or anything. He just didn't want to manage Lincoln anymore. So going to really use it. Lincoln was 17th when he left, though, which I know is a bit of a drop-off from last season of the playoffs. A bit like Barnsley's drop-off, just not as severe. But ultimately, Michael Appleton is a legend at the club, and he did a lot for them. So, yeah. Stephen Robinson would have kept at the club. Well, another one which really doesn't count. He went to go and join St Mirren, and he was respected at the club. And the fans actually thought it would be there for the long term, and maybe he could have done a very good job with Morecambe. Although they've not done a bad job, they survived in League One. So, yeah, you know. Ryan Lowe, right. I know he also left off his own accord. He went to go and join Preston. I would have stayed at Plymouth if I was him, although he's done all right with Preston. But he did play a major part in Plymouth's turnaround. And maybe, I don't think they actually reached the playoffs in the end. But they maybe could have done if they were under Lowe for the whole season. Lee Johnson, I would have kept. It was a bit of an overreaction, I think we can all admit in hindsight. They lost 6-0 to Bolton after he was dismissed. But before that, very good form. They had only lost once in 13 games. And Sunderland were in 3rd place. So there was clearly a drop-off after he left. They have also played well in those games. And lots of his players were brought in during the January transfer window. So it seems a bit odd to replace them at such a critical time, meaning that there would have to be another bedding-in period, as well as all these complicated things of a new philosophy to get across. And he did all right with the club. Sunderland, you need to stop going with the managerial merry-go-round. Mark Cooper, I would have kept. They were 6 points clear of relegation zone. And before the Cumbrian derby, they were unbeaten in 3. They had only 9 games left to play, and Senior Scunthorpe and Oldham have been so bad this season, I really highly doubt Cooper would have got Barrow relegated. So, not necessary. Derek Adams, I would have sacked. He was being very big headed. I mean, that's the only way to describe him, as arrogant. He was like, "Oh, no one could replace me as manager at Bradford. I'm the best manager in League Two. And I'm going to get them into the playoffs. I'm the only one who can do that." Well, he lost 3 games on the bounce, and then they lost another 2 after he was sacked, which and that is kind of a legacy. It's still his ideas and teams at that point, isn't it? And it was just so much of a bad effect on the club. They only won 1 game in his last 5 games, and they were 8 points off the playoffs. So maybe he's not the best manager in League Two after all. Chris Beach, I would have kept. Money is clearly not the issue with the club, as they've been stagnating for years. They've got through 3 managers this season, and I'm not blaming the players, but rather the owners. And therefore, really, the managership is not at fault for it to. Keith Millen also would have kept. He had less than 4 months in charge, and he had an all-right return. He had 4 wins, 4 draws, and 9 losses in all competitions. Again, it's the owner's fault, not really the manager's. Hayden Mullins, I would have sacked. He was 22nd in the table when he was dismissed, just avoiding relegation places. He hadn't won a game from the end of November to mid-January. That is 7 games, and he lost 5 games on the bounce. John Yems, I would have kept based on performances, but I would have sacked him because of his racial abuse of players meant really that he had to be sacked. So it's a bit of a hard one to call that one, isn't it? Dave Challoner, he wasn't sacked. He moved to Stockport County, so I don't think this really counts. But there has been a nosedive in form since he left, so probably wasn't the best decision. But Stockport have improved under him, so maybe it was a good decision for his career after all. Graham Lee, I would have sacked. He won only 1 game in 11 matches. However, he wasn't entirely responsible for 5 defeats. However, the run in April was entirely his fault. It was awful. There was 4 defeats in 6 games during that month, and there was absolutely no wins in that spell as well. Kenny Jackett, I would have sacked. Leyton Orient only scored 1 goal in a 9-game winner streak. They also only received 2 points from 10 games and caused the O's to fall into a relegation scrap. And I don't know whether they should have been at the beginning of the season. I would have more thought they would have been in mid-table. So maybe it was the right call. Michael Flynn would have kept at the club. He spent 4 years with the club and had some good cup upsets against Swansea and Watford. But he's the only thing really staying his CV is that he's sort of bottled the playoffs. But you didn't even get in the playoffs in the end anyhow, did you, Newport? So he did resign over not being consistent. But I have no doubt that if he did remain manager, he would have got Newport to the playoffs. And we could have even received promotion under him. You never know. Keith Curle, I would have kept. Under these owners, there's been 9 managerial sackings, including Curle. They weren't in the relegation zone when he was sacked, and since then have dropped like a stone. He had a much better defensive record in his last matches and had many injuries to his squad. He also had a transfer embargo, so couldn't bring any players in, and the owners didn't even communicate with the manager. So I think we all know where the blame actually lies with the ownership. John Sheridan, I would have sacked. To be fair, the owners of the club are awful. However, nothing can justify losing 6 games in a row and then another 5 games in a row after only 2 games of not losing. That's 2 wins in 16 games and 9 points during that time. Neil Cox, I would have kept. It was really only 15 minutes at Colchester that cost him his job, really. But despite being bottom of the league, it's the owners who are tying his arms behind his back, as they have refused to back him during the transfer window. And the timing is really odd, as before that Colchester game, they picked up 4 points from the 2 previous games. The chairman has sacked 8 managers in 8 years, and it's also his fault that the club was under a transfer embargo, and so he couldn't really assemble a squad that was competitive in League Two. He also had injuries to his wingers, and ultimately he was doing the best of the worst squad in the league. Keith Hill, I would have sacked. He has had long enough to change the culture of the club, and he got them into a losing streak twice. The first was a run of 7 straight defeats, and then he had another run of 7 straight defeats. Many managers would have been sacked, considering that he has only won 1 game since January. The standards are so low with him at the wheel, and stories of players turning up late shows he has no respect from his dressing room, and they conspire against him. Yes, the owners need to be blamed, but so does the players and the manager. He has only got a win percentage of 6.06%. Alex Revel I would have kept. They were 4 from bottom when he was dismissed, and 2 points from safety, and they finished the season at 4 from bottom. So nothing really changed with removing him, and where does Stevenage realistically expect to finish? He had a decent start to the season and took the League One playoff contenders MK Dons to a replay, which they won, although he wasn't in charge during the replay. I think that was a pretty good performance, all things considering. Paul Tisdale I would have kept. He had the club 3 points above relegation zone in 22nd and gained 20 points in 16 matches, which isn't bad for a relegation contending side. Tisdale probably would have saved them from relegation, but he didn't get the chance, but thankfully for Borough fans, they were safe. Matthew Taylor I would have sacked. The Saddlers lost their 7th successive game at the bottom of the table, Scunthorpe United, before they decided to part company with Taylor, as he left them just 4 points above the drop zone. 7 losses in a row is not acceptable, and in 2022 they were in free fall throughout pretty much the whole year. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you're new around here. That'd be highly appreciated. I will be doing the much requested video of looking at my predictions at the beginning of the season next week on Friday. I don't think I got many of them right, although I know I've got a couple at least. But goodbye for now.